So without further ado, please welcome our keynote speaker, Miss Zena Hitz. It's terrifying, sorry.
Thanks so much. It's wonderful to be here.
Can I steal my coffee back from you? Sorry.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh,
No,
there we go. There we go.
Hoarding coffee is definitely not acceptable. It's wonderful to be here talking to people who are really, and I think of the forefront, the vanguard of the transformation of education that we're seeing right now. It's very exciting for me. I spent my life in higher education, but we all know that education and culture don't go anywhere without K through 12 education. And it's very exciting to see, as I've seen growing in intensity, a recognition of all the things that are going wrong in our mainstream institutions and a kind of consensus, whatever our differences with one another, that the solution is a return to our traditions, to great books, to conversation, to in-person communities built on reading and conversation. So I'm honored to be here to talk through some of my ideas about what it means to be a teacher and the authority of a teacher. So I thought I'd begin something I noticed a while ago reading Genesis. It's not often read at Mass, right? It's the Easter Vigil, which if you have a ton of young kids, maybe you're not at the Easter Vigil. But it's the first reading. It's a very long, beautiful reading, the opening of Genesis. And every time I read it or hear it, whether I read it for class or hear it in Mass, whatever, I always notice something new. And one of the things I noticed recently is there's a kind of detail in the living things that God creates. Okay, so we all know the structure. God creates first the sort of space of the world, and then he fills it with living creatures. And this is how he describes plants. Now you might be surprised I'm talking about plants, but I'll explain. Okay. So this is Genesis 1:11. Then God said, "Let the earth bring forth vegetation, every kind of plant that bears seed, and every kind of fruit tree on earth that bears fruit with its seed in it." And so it happened. The earth brought forth vegetation, every kind of plant that bears seed, and every kind of fruit tree that bears fruit with its seed in it. God saw that it was good. He does that before he even separates the light from the day. And then, of course, he creates the fish, the water creatures, the birds of the air, the land animals, both domesticated and wild, and the human beings. And it's repeated. Those of you who have dabbled in biblical scholarship know that scholars think that the first and second chapter of Genesis had different origins. But here we are in the second chapter. Let's see here. I swore it had it in it. So the garden, right, is full of these trees which have fruits with the seed in it, right? So it's something about the intricacy of that language, that each plant bears its own seed and each fruit tree has the seeds in it, right? And of course it's connected to God's great exhortation in these sections to go forth and to multiply. So in the world of Genesis, and I think we think this is true, living things multiply themselves. This is something that we are. This I think could help us to understand what kind of thing teaching is. Bear with me. And one way to see how that might matter for teaching and for authority is to think about Exodus, the commandment to honor your father and your mother. Now, Leon Cass, who's a thinker I very much admire, has these wonderful commentaries on Genesis and Exodus. And the way that he explained the commandment to honor one's father and mother, I have never forgotten. And the way that he understands it, and I think this must be true, is that you honor your father and mother. You don't honor the ruler. You don't honor Pharaoh. You don't honor the powers of the world, who in many ancient cultures are worshipped as gods. Right? So instead of honoring Pharaoh, instead of honoring Caesar, instead of honoring the ruler, one honors one's father and mother. And the thing about one's father and mother is that they were once like you, and you, in turn, will become like them. So they are part of this self-multiplying, self-reproducing process whereby humans come to be. And that's not just biological, okay? Otherwise, I wouldn't be talking about it in a conference on teaching. It's also something about the way that teaching also works, the way that we pass things on from one generation to the next. And there's a kind of equality, even though the father and the mother are honored, so they have an authority. That authority is not the same kind of authority that God has. It's not the same kind of authority that Pharaoh has. It's the kind of authority that an older being has for a younger being of the same kind, okay? Because each of us has the same seed of humanity, right? Father, mother, child, grandparent. It's all one being that unfolds over time. And so what that means for education, beyond biological reproduction, it means that what we are doing as teachers is replacing ourselves, multiplying ourselves. We are not shaping materials, okay? That's the great contrast, right? We're living things. We are not clay, we are not rock, we are not wood, to be shaped and formed into something that we imagine in advance. The shape and the form is given to us. It's given to us by our parents or by our teachers. And it's our work to nurture that in the young, okay? So that when we die, grow old and die, the young will be there to take our place. And I also think, this might be obvious, I don't mean by self-multiplying or by replacing oneself that you make little clones, right? That's never how it works, either in biological reproduction or anything else, and certainly not in the animal world or the plant world. It's not about clones, but it's about preserving and allowing to grow that seed of who we are, of who God created us to be, which is a kind of life. It's a source of activities. It's a way of being. It's rich. It's integrated with all kinds of other things. It's not just our reason. It's not just our emotions. It's not just our habits. It's somehow, if you imagine, I was trained in classical philosophy, and in Plato and Aristotle, we have this notion of eudaimonia, or flourishing, which I'm sure is familiar to you. And one of the things I love about the word flourishing is that it sounds like you're just like a little tree, like sending out leaves. You're being what you are. No one made a tree, okay? No one pulled the tree out of the ground to make it what it is. No one shapes or carves out the flowers on the edge of its branches or pulls out the leaves and shapes them just so. The tree is what it is because of the seed that it has in it. And that doesn't mean it's all automatic, and I'll get to that in a second, but it does mean that as teachers, we can rely and we must rely on the capacity of our students to have our complete understanding that our students have the seeds in them for growth to become the kinds of beings that they're meant to be. I think that's the major challenge for teachers in our culture, because we live in a culture that does things, that makes things, that controls things, and there's many gifts to that. I love bridges and skyscrapers as much as anyone does, but a human being is not a bridge, and a human being is not a skyscraper. So that's all to say that we are not gods. Our rulers are not gods. We replace ourselves we multiply ourselves, and that means our authority is temporary. It's conditional. It's received from something else, something that comes before us, and it's transmitted by being, in many ways, what we are. So a good part of teaching is not designing techniques, right? It's being who you are and being developed in such a way that by being around you, the young can develop as they should. So teaching in a fundamental way is like being a parent, as I understand it in this respect. It's less what you do, it's less your techniques, it's less your projects, and it's what's really fundamental is who you are, who you, the teacher, are. And there's a reason why we avoid this and why it's hard, because that's actually just a terrifying thought. When I think about this, I'm literally filled with fear and trembling, because I think, how could I be, what if what I am is really not quite good enough? What of myself do I really want to see reproduced in others, right? There's this really common effect with kids, right? There's some swear word just comes out of your mouth, and then you hear it come straight out of the mouth of the child, and you're like, oh, okay, wait, this is not what I wanted to reproduce. So the challenge of being an adult, the challenge of being an authority, of being a parent or being a teacher is to develop oneself to be the kind of person, the kind of being that the young will become. Not in a rigid way, again, not in a, everyone should be exactly alike, but in the sense that young people are drawn to what's good in others. They want to imitate others. They'll do so in a way that you can't predict. But that imitation, that modeling, on the part of us, and mentoring, which goes along with it, right? How does a carpenter teach someone how to do carpentry? Well, you watch the carpenter work for a bit, and then the person works, and then you show them what you do, you the carpenter, right? You're transmitting your own activity, your own skill, your own knowledge to the young person. And that's, I'm not a percentage person. Is it 90% imitation? Is it 80%? It's a very, very high percentage of imitation and modeling. And that's a terrifying thought, because we're not all that much in control of what we model and what we mentor, and it requires constant attentiveness. So one thing I think this means for teaching in classical schools, teaching high school, teaching great books, is that you must live the intellectual life that you want for the students. So it's really hard to pass on something that you don't have yourself, that you don't live yourself. And that means that we can't just be people who know where the good books are, people who know the important parts of it. We can't just be following guidance from others. We have to actually make the life of the mind our own. And we, as teachers, have to be actively reading, thinking, getting in conversations, asking questions. And one of the signs of a really excellent school to me is that the teachers do that together. One of the things I love about St. John's, where I teach now, is that we get together multiple times a week and we talk about the things that we're reading with one another, with no students in the room. So that what we're talking about is not always directly connected to what happens in the classroom, but the fact that I am doing some thinking on my own with others about the material that I'm teaching means that it's alive for me. And my students see that life and they follow it. It means something to them. It excites them and they're drawn to it and they grow in that direction. And I know that because we've all experienced as teachers, you have a bad day, you have a bad month, you have a bad year, you're not alive, you're really just kind of going through the motions, and you can see the effect, the difference in the effect on the students. if you're not really interested in this material, if you're not engaging yourself with the material, if it's not alive for you, there are real limitations as to what you can offer a student. So one of the other burdens of teaching as a living being, not as an artisan, not as an engineer, but as a living being, is that one has to be cultivating all the time one's own intellectual life. And that's not selfishness, that's not being pulled out of something you're supposed to be doing. That's just actually the best way for teaching to take place, is for the young to see older people doing the thing that's interesting, that's full of joy, that's full of enthusiasm, and they are drawn to it and they grow in it. That's sort of my first main point that I wanted to make on the basis of Genesis and the ways that we are like plants. One other feature of this plant analogy, which I'm going to run with for a bit, maybe for most of the talk, honestly, is that it doesn't just require one's cultivation of oneself. It involves a profound trust in the student. That is, the student is not a blank slate. The student is not a block of marble. The student is not a pile of bricks or a piece of metal that needs to be melted and molded. A student has the seeds of life within each of them, okay? They have the seeds of the thing that you're trying to cultivate. So that, I think, should be consoling, because it means that for me as a teacher, I succeed the more I trust that this student is going to develop in the way that I think that they will do, that they have a natural desire, inbuilt desire to learn, that they will find joy in it, that they have capacities for it, okay? Each student is different, we all know that. Each young person is different, each human being is different. What that means will be different for different students. But they have that seeds in them. And some of my most powerful experiences as a teacher and as a student are along those lines. So I had a teacher when I was an undergrad at St. John's, a very strange woman, wonderful woman, Mira Flamenhoff. And she would look, she'd ask you a question like, do you think that Aeneas is functioning from his own free will, or do you think that he's just being sort of pushed along by the destiny of the gods? And she would look at you straight in the eyes, until you wanted to die. Right? This expectation that I would have something to say about this question. This expectation that I would have something to say about this question. I think she called it, and sometimes people at St. John's call it, taking students seriously. Looking at them in the eye and saying, I know that you can do this. Not saying it with words, but saying it by just laying the expectation before them. And it's important to calibrate that. It doesn't mean you expect that each student will have a certain level of predetermined excellence that they'll achieve. That might not be true. The life of the mind is, again, a form of life. Not every tree is tall, not every bush is bushy, some things flower more than others, everything's different, each one is beautiful in its own way, etc. But they do all have the life within them. And to look someone in the eye and take them seriously is, for me, the most profound thing I can do as a teacher. And that's an example of, what am I doing? I'm not waiting for a particular answer to a question I've already decided. I'm asking something open-ended. I'm assuming that this student is a free being who has sort of their own spontaneous approach to the world. And what's funny is that that being treated in that way actually nurtures that capacity. So when I was 19 years old and met Mira Flamenhoff, I was not worthy of being taken seriously. I was extremely immature. And I was very pretentious and was interested in appearing intelligent. I was not really interested in actually doing the thing. But by having someone who looked me in the eye and said, "I know you can do this," that part of me started to grow. It was already there. It started to grow. And then now, this is part of my plant self-reproduction thing. Now I do that for my students. Last spring, I came back from sabbatical, and there was this student who, was sitting in class totally silent, like scribbling in her notebook, totally silent. And, at some point in the conversation, I was like, "Well, what's in the notebook? Tell us what's going on." And she looked at me like I had done something. And then all of a sudden, there's this human being in there who's thinking, who's imagining, who's puzzling, who's reaching for things. And so that is something I try to keep at the core of my teaching, is being extremely confident that each student has seeds in them to grow, and to wait for it. Not to be anxious. It's challenging. Not to be anxious when it's not working, when the conversation isn't going well, and you suspect that somehow it's just not going to work because you're not a good teacher. This is always how I think. Because I'm not a good teacher, they're not going to learn properly. They're not going to get it. They're not getting it. They're not getting the thing I think they should get. But whenever I sit back with confidence and wait for it to happen, it happens. Teaching, learning is something that the young are capable of because of capacities within themselves. It's already there in them. You don't have to implant it in them. You don't have to form it. I mean, you do. That's not quite true. You do have to form it. But that's more. I'll talk about that in a second. But you don't have to shape it in a particular way. You don't have to organize it according to a predetermined mold. So education is like almost like a reproductive process. It's, the plants teaching other plants how to be plants. Okay? Or one way I think about it, this is, it tells you a bit of the tension in the way that I'm thinking about this. But so if I take this organic metaphor very seriously, because it's not really just a metaphor. Life of the mind really is just a kind of life. It's just part of who we are as living beings. Okay, so teacher's like a gardener, right? Not a manufacturer, but a gardener. But the weird thing is the gardener is also a plant, right? Now, I don't know how that makes any sense to you, but that's, I think, how I understand it. So there are modes where I think of myself as being an adult plant, modeling, inviting, offering others into the life of the mind that I have hospitably and openly and charitably, and with the expectation that that's something that they would want. The same way that if you invite someone to dinner, you expect that they'll be hungry. Okay, you invite someone to the table, your seminar table, with the expectation that they're going to be hungry for it. That's just what's going to be true. They're built that way. So on the one hand, I'm modeling it. I'm the fully grown plant. And on the other hand, I'm the gardener who understands how growth works best. And I know that from my experience. Watching others grow, my experience as a teacher, my experience in growing up myself, my experience of my own education, all of that goes into the work of becoming a gardener who's experienced, who can see how plants grow. So in this part of the talk, I'm moving towards, I wanted to start by thinking about us as free, spontaneous plants that are going to grow and bloom on our own volition. But of course, we all know that teaching isn't really like that. We do have to exercise authority. And what's the nature of our authority? our nature of authority is the authority of the gardener, is the authority who knows what the conditions are for plants to grow. So what kind of soil is good, what kind of light is needed, what kind of space each plant needs to have room to move. A garden is an orderly place, right? It's not, I'm not a fan of the French garden. I like an English garden, but it's orderly. It's not just throw a bunch of seeds out there and let it all grow over into a jungle, because that means that you won't have the right conditions for every plant to grow in the way that it's meant to grow. So we need some kind of oversight, some kind of perspective, an authoritative perspective on which we're supervising the growth of the young, with the expectation that they do have within them the power to grow. Again, the gardener doesn't pull plants out of the ground. The gardener doesn't shape flowers on the edge of the stem. The gardener provides the conditions, and the gardener waits, and the gardener watches, and the gardener appreciates, right? One of the things I love about that first chapter of Genesis is God like doing this stuff and then sitting back and being like, isn't that beautiful? Like, well, I love this. I like this. It seems somehow surprising that God would do that, right? He'd know somehow what was going to happen. But I think it's being modeled for us how we should respond to the growth, to the natural growth of things. We sit back and we say, it's good. And of course, our saying it's good has a real impact on those students. If you appreciate what's good, you wait for what's good and you appreciate it. Young people know in a half second that you appreciate it, and it's part of your inbuilt authority as a teacher or parent that what you appreciate, they are going to want to do. So the gardener creates an environment, and I think in these cases about creating a classroom or a school, what should it be like for students to grow in it? Oh, well, I think it should have a kind of silence in it, have a kind of peacefulness. It should be orderly, it should be clean, it should be simple. Because that's what you would do if you were expecting things to grow. So I find it very discouraging. I'm sure that I'm sure that you share this view of mine, but every now and then they try to re-engineer a college classroom. They're like packed with stuff. It's like they're not going to learn unless we cover the walls with, slogans and advertising and screens. They tried for a while this inverted classroom where the walls were covered with screens and everyone's facing away from each other and looking at the screen. Okay, this is that's my sort of example of, okay, how could you design a classroom in the worst possible way? Okay, treat the young as people who passively need to be entertained by screens and who have nothing to do with one another. Okay? I love our St. John's classrooms. It's something I always try to show people when they're visiting campus. They have just these very simple, big wooden tables, some beautiful chairs, cane chairs, blackboards, and that's it. Right? Blackboards you fill with the things that you are thinking. The walls are pretty simple. They're pretty empty. That means that you, the student, or you, the teacher, can have the freedom to generate your own images, to generate your own thoughts, to let them turn one into the other. You're not being bombarded with stuff. And our culture bombards us. We're bombarded by advertising, by invitations, by this and by that. So that's what I think of as being the garden of the classroom, is some place where there's space, there's order, there's cleanliness, and there's simplicity. And all that space and emptiness and silence is the space, right? If we were gardening, we would leave space for each plant to grow. We wouldn't just throw a bunch of seeds out there and let it go. That space is crucial. The space to let each student feel themselves as a free being, and have room in which to imagine and to grow without being bombarded. And of course, one other thing about this kind of table, right, is the core of collaboration, which I think is also key to education. So one of the other things that happens in a garden is the plants work, the gardener coordinates the plants to work together, so to speak, right? It's not a garden is not a competition. We don't say, okay, yeah, which tree's gonna be the tallest? Okay, and I'm planting a bunch of trees and I'm gonna see who's the tallest. And then I'm gonna give that one a gold star. Who's gonna bloom the most, you know? It's not a competition. It's a home. It's a space where people live, where the plants live. And each person, each student contributes because each student has this capacity, this inbuilt capacity. One of the things I was talking at Thomas Aquinas College last year, this might be a little controversial, but that's okay. I was talking at Thomas Aquinas College, and my gosh, have I been rattling just on and on? No, I'm okay. I'm actually in good time. I saw my watch upside down. Anyway, I was at Thomas Aquinas College. And one of the tutors there said, well, you know, how can you read all these books which are wrong, like books which are deeply wrong about the way the world is? You know, and I kind of paused for a second. Because at St. John's we read everything. It's not a Christian school. We read the Bible, we read Augustine, we read Aquinas, but we read Nietzsche, and we spend a ton of time in the Enlightenment, all kinds of stuff. How can we read these books that are wrong? And I sort of like paused for a second, and I was like, well, I remembered something that a Dominican priest told me once, which was that God shares a unique piece of himself with each human being, right? Unique piece of himself. So each human being is a portal to some aspect of God that you can't see any other way. And that means you can learn from anybody, right? And especially, of course, the young who, because they're more innocent, because they're less experienced, are so full of possibilities, right? They haven't necessarily been distorted or misshapen by hard experiences. So you have to think of each of your students as having that seed of life that's going to grow and that's going to contribute to this garden, this home, this space where different types of people and people with different talents and different abilities who see different things can flourish together. And this, I think, is one of the great testimonies, actually, of St. John's, where one of our other scandalous things, apart from reading books that are wrong, is really treating each student as contributing to the discussion, so that every single student at the table should be speaking. And that I, the professor, who may have been studying this book for 2 decades, 3 decades, sometimes less. I read a lot of stuff I don't know. I teach a lot of stuff I don't know very well, but sometimes I'm teaching something I know extremely well, and I can learn something from each of my students, even on something I know very well. And that's part of the testament of, that's partly made possible in the testament of the great books. So the great books are pieces of reality, I'd say, pieces of human reality that are so rich and so complex that when we look at them together, people of all abilities, all levels, all character types, they can all dig in and they can all come away with something. So they're means by which everyone can grow. They're sort of the soil or the water or the sunshine, okay, of the garden. And they're also, you know, I said at the beginning of the talk when I was talking about honoring one's parents, you honor your parents, and they honored their parents, and they honored their parents, and they honored their parents. You're like, well, where did the thing that's being passed on come from, right? It doesn't belong to any of us. It's something that we receive and pass on. And the great books are a beautiful, not just an image of that, but a reality of that. We have these traditions of teaching. There are going to be people in this room who know much more about the history of education than I do, but some of them are going to go all the way back. People have been reading Homer, I think, more or less since Homer died. I mean, like, since the 7th century BC, people have read and puzzled over Homer. That's a very, very old practice that's been passed down to us. Or they've studied the Bible, or they've studied the classics. And that's a living tradition. It's not a museum. So each of the authors that come later have read some of the earlier ones, right? So they're sort of digesting the past and turning it into the future, blossoming it into the future. There's something common that's passed along, the universal sort of human experiences, but each book expresses something different. So you have this incredible sense of riches, incredible riches that we've received from the past, and which, are food for our minds, which help our minds to grow. So if what I said at the beginning sounded kind of impossible, somehow we're supposed to have this life of the mind that the young are going to imitate. We're supposed to be already practicing it. And we kind of have to wait and watch for it to happen. And it's going to happen to different people differently. That might sound impossible until you bring in that curriculum, the great books. Because the great books are, they're the soil in which we grow. They're the things which every student, no matter how challenged, every teacher, no matter how full of oneself I can get, we can all come to this resource and learn things. It's that active learning from the past that sustains us in this activity. Now, Eva told me to be very concrete and practical, and I don't think I've been super concrete and practical, although I've tried. Let me just try to go back for a second before I move on. So we teach understanding that we are different stages of growth of the same type of being, right? We're the plants with their seeds in it. We bear the fruit that has the seed for the plant in it, okay? We're self-multipliers. We multiply ourselves. We reproduce ourselves. And teaching is a part of that reproduction. It's a part of that passing on from the past, what we receive, into the future. And we pass it on in just the way that it's passed on in animals and plants, right? Not every rose bush looks the same. Not every grain of wheat is exactly the same, although I guess we breed them that way these days. There's a core thing that's the seed that then is expressed in an infinite number of ways. And so because we're not gods, because we're not rulers, our job is to, on the one hand, live out that activity, to be the living beings that we are, and to trust that the students will imitate us, and also to trust that the young are capable of this type of life. They don't have to be shaped and molded towards preordained objectives. They have it within them, the same way they have it within them to play sports. I mean, you think about how elaborate the sports cultivation is in our culture, right? There's coaches and teams, and there's like trips every weekend, and there's practice. But if you see kids playing a sport, they don't look like they've been made to do something. They look like they're being who they are. I used to watch my nephew play football. He was captain of the high school football team. Just like, this is who I felt like I was seeing, this is who this person is. If you remember that Hopkins poem, which is in the back of my mind as I'm talking, right? What I do is me, it is for that I came. Right? This is us in activity. Right? We human beings in activity. Okay, so We are like gardeners, okay? That's the mode of authority that we have. We don't just let all the seeds grow up any old way. We create conditions for that to happen. And we see, because we're adults, because we have minds, because we're thoughtful people, because we're aware of what we're doing and we're doing it intentionally, we know that what the end or the activity of the life of the mind looks like. And that's what we keep in mind when we're organizing our classroom, when we're organizing our school, when we're a headmaster, we're an administrator, a principal, anyone who governs this activity. You do that in light of the final end, in light of the activity, the life of the mind that you're looking for. And you know what that is, not from books, not from education courses necessarily. You know it from experience because you live it, because you've received it. And if you, like many of us, you may not have grown up with this type of education. You may not feel like you have it within you. So you have to find it for yourself now, through friends and community members and books and the works of the past. But you're cultivating that vision of what it looks like. So that's my substitute for learning outcomes. I've never had to persuade an administrator that this is the way to do it, because it's not measurable, so it doesn't fulfill their criteria. But what's the thing that provides the order to the school or to the classroom? It's that sense of what this life looks like. It's a sense of what things look like when it's going well. And to constantly be thinking about what the conditions for that are. What are the conditions? I've suggested silence, simplicity, community, mutual respect, a sense that each person, each student can learn and be learned from, and this wonderful soil of the great books, which feeds us and makes us active, makes us grow, no matter who we are, no matter what our level is. Okay. So one other thing I wanted to add to that is it also has a scriptural background. In a letter from James, he has this line, which I remember because I was once in a chorus that sang Brahms' Requiem. I don't know how many of you are musical people, but it's beautifully set in that piece. But you see how the farmer waits for the fruit of the earth, for the early rain and the late rain. Okay, be patient. So you are watching and waiting for the thing to happen. I'm not a farmer. I'm not even much of a gardener. But a lot of what you do is wait. You provide conditions and you wait and you watch and you appreciate. Now, there's a slogan by John the 23rd, Pope John the 23rd, which I think about a lot in this context in terms of watching and waiting and being patient and trusting, as I said earlier, trusting that the capacity to do this is within the students themselves. And so John the 23rd apparently said, notice everything, say little, correct almost never. I think about this a lot because I'm so bad at it. I'm such a corrector. It's so easy for teachers. It's one of the things I notice in myself as I grow as a teacher and in my colleagues. Criticism is the easiest thing to do. It's shooting fish in a barrel. What is this student not doing? Always an answer to that question. Boy, there's always something that could be fixed, right? But you shouldn't, of course, ignore it. It's not that you should ignore it or pretend it's not there or pretend that right is wrong and wrong is right. No, you notice everything, but you correct almost never. What are you doing? You're waiting for something to happen. And you're trusting that the good thing is going to happen and not just the bad thing, right? And so that you're waiting in expectation for the seed to grow in the student. And I have seen cases where, you sit we have classes last an entire year, as probably many of you do. I have seen students who looked like blobs for months. They walk in the room and you're like, you might be in the wrong place. I say this thing about how like God shares a piece of himself with everyone, but maybe he missed you. And then, like it's April, you've been in there all year, and there it is, something that comes out, and you see it like a flash of an instant. And when you see that, you acknowledge it, you appreciate it, you say with God, this is good. And the more the longer I'm a teacher, the more I see that recognizing the good, looking for what's good and recognizing it is way more powerful than correction, way more powerful. Correction almost never works in my experience. You say, you are constantly, now of course this is with college kids, it might be, you might have some experience with younger kids where this is less true, but you've got to stop being late to class. That is the most useless thing possible to say, right? You have to find some other way to do it, often. You can set a boundary, you can set penalties, sometimes you have to do that. But that's what you do sort of at the margins, at the outside. Most of what you really need to be doing, in my experience, is waiting for the good and recognizing it when you see it. And you know it's coming because you're modeling it. You have it within you. You're looking for it all the time. They see you looking for it. You're reading these wonderful books. And what are you doing when you're reading these impossible texts sometimes? Sometimes you just want to die. You open one up. You're like, okay, maybe I want to, what was that? My class I'm teaching this year is in Foundations of Physics at St. John's. We do this scientific program. And we were working on this paper on the wave equation. And it was so hard. I just wanted to die. And at one point I looked at my students and I was like, can we have a bad books program? Because I feel dumb and I don't like this. I don't like feeling dumb, right? But to have to be always just looking, however difficult it is, to be looking for what's good, right? So pouring through these texts can be like waiting for the blob of a student to wake up. You're looking for something to hang on to. Something good, something meaningful, something insightful. Okay. So for all of this, we need order, simplicity. We need a structure. Order and structure are the source of peace, calm. They allow people to function. But also, we want them to permit freedom and spontaneity. We want to let each of those students and the teachers to live out their way of doing this in just their own way. You don't know whether they're a flowering shrub or a blade of grass or a big tree. You don't know exactly who's in your classroom, whether they're teachers or students. So you have to leave some space for them to be whatever they're going to be. And to have a vision, to develop continually our vision of what the end is that we're seeking, which is not just the good remark in a student, the good insight, or the passage in the book that starts to make sense, but a vision of this whole way of life, this whole kind of community of the life of the mind. And then even stepping back from that, the way that the life of the mind fits in with a whole human life. Okay, that I think I'm not reading it upside down. I think I am out of time. I think I've finished my remarks. So thank you so much for listening, and I'm open to any questions.
By my watch, it is 10:56, so Zena can take questions for exactly 4 minutes.
No, that means I went overtime. Oh, you're not supposed to correct me. Just to give me space to move. Anyway, feel free, if you don't have time to ask a question, to come up to me later and talk. I'd be happy to hear any response or feedback or criticisms even. You can correct me, seriously.
Zena, could you hand me, there's a wireless mic down there in that podium, and I can go give it to people. You got it? Okay.
Zena, would you mind repeating the question back?
Sure.
I was just wondering what you said in response to the person who asked you about the reading books that had wrong things in them. Just wondering what your reply was.
Ask the question one more time.
When you talked about someone asked you about reading things that
Oh,
had
yes.
wrong things in them,
Yeah.
what was your reply?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So the question is, what was my reply when someone said, "Why do you read wrong books?" And I said, a priest told me once that God shares a piece of himself with each human being. And that means you can learn from anyone and everyone. That was what I said. But come back at me, because that was a controversial part. I don't know if he liked my answer, honestly. He sort of quieted down and sat back.
Thanks for your great talk. I wanted to raise a question about your approach. We've seen, with the gardening analogy, very beginning.
Yeah.
And obviously we live in a post-fall world with thorns and thistles and sweat of the ground. So without seeing, without following a Pelagianism or some sort of like overly simplistic vision of human nature pre-fall, how do you, in your as an educator, account for the thorns? How do you account for the fact that when I put the good in front of someone, they're not going to choose it, potentially, right? And that the power of attraction of the good is probably our greatest ally. I'm 100% with you. But of course, as educators, we have to think about the thorns and the thistles in that garden analogy. And I just love to hear you riff on that for a minute.
Sure. So one thing I always remind myself of, or try to, is that in our teaching in the Catholic faith, grace builds on nature. So we don't believe, as I understand it as Catholics, and there are theologians here who can correct me, but we don't believe that our nature is totally destroyed or corrupted, that we can't choose the good. We don't even think that you can't do it without grace, because we have still a nature. The nature's fallen, the nature's wounded, the nature's wrecked, but it's still there. And it's still capable in its own way of getting a glimmer of the good and responding to that attraction. So one of the things, this is my experience, and my experience is as a convert. So I grew up I came from a very, very liberal, very secular background. And for me, going to St. John's, which is a secular school, not a Catholic school, it had this sense of just like, finally I could breathe. I was happy there. I felt cared for. I felt safe. I felt free to be who I was. And I started to relax. And it might sound like a banal kind of way to put it, but it was true. Whereas I think part of being a secular person in a fallen world is you operate by fear. A lot of the things that we see in the world that are horrible, that are vicious and depraved, a lot of it is based in fear. Not all of it, some of it's malice. We believe in malice too. But I think that, so that providing natural goods, safety, respect, real, like substantive learning. People liked learning without Christ, right? So Plato and Aristotle, in some ways, who are our intellectual founders, they didn't have faith, but they provided us with a lot of materials that we learn from, that Augustine learned from, that Aquinas learned from, and that we learned from through them and without them. So I think it does require attentiveness to these natural goods. I've seen the same thing in the religious community I lived in. It's in a beautiful rural area. People are kind and caring, and there's food on the table, and there's work that means something. And again, it's just, you relax. It's not to say that it's not a recipe for success. There is no such thing, right? You can be a pretty good gardener and get something in your garden that you can't work with. But I think it really is key for us as American Catholics to remember that grace builds on nature, and that there are natural goods that even people without access to the sacraments, those are available to them. And it's the biggest engine of conversion that I know. And then once you have grace, then I think your question maybe becomes more diminished, right? Because then you have this other, you pray your way through your classes, you have this, this aid, this help that comes from God for us to regain our natural good, and then more than that.
Thank you, Zena.